Horror video games have always been a popular genre, but in recent years, the rise of independent game developers has led to a surge in unique and innovative horror titles that have become an important part of the horror gaming landscape and show no signs of slowing down. But when we look back over the early days of gaming, the industry was dominated by large studios with huge financial budgets, endless resources, and a desire to appeal to the broadest possible audience. But as technology advanced, indie developers began to emerge on the scene, defining a new era for horror games to take shape. The titles often developed had smaller budgets and teams, but they more than made up for it with their creativity and commitment to the genre. They pushed boundaries and explored new ideas way beyond what was thought possible in previous generations, delving deeper into the darkness than their mainstream counterparts ever dared. The rise of indie horror video games is very reflective of its increasing popularity and recognition of independently developed horror games seen within the video game industry. These games are created by small teams known as individual independent developers rather than large game studios, and often have unique and creative concepts that differentiate them from mainstream horror games that are produced. The indie horror game scene has exploded in popularity in recent years, with many small developers creating innovative and terrifying experiences for players to break away from the limitations and social norms defined by the upper echelon of mega-rich AAA companies and brands to develop new innovative ideas and test new boundaries that were considered too taboo or deemed socially unacceptable within the mainstream media. In this video we will look at the rise of indie horror games, the key players and titles in the genre, and what makes these games so successful at capturing the attention and imagination of players. But first, let's define what we mean by indie horror games. These are video games created by small independent developers, often with limited resources and funding compared to larger studios. These developers often rely on crowdfunding platforms like Kickstarter, Steam Early Access or itch.io to get their projects off the ground. One of the key factors in the rise of indie horror games is the proliferation of digital distribution platforms like Steam, itch.io and goodoldgames.com. These platforms have made it much easier than ever for small developers to get their games in front of a larger audience of players to discover and purchase games from a wide range of sources, while unleashing new levels of creativity never seen before within the video game industry. The games seen during the early days of indie games development would range from a variety of sources such as mobile games and more experimental horror experiences that would be presentable visually but would lack the polish and more refinement of AAA games seen in the genre. Dev teams would later explore low poly aesthetics seen in legendary games during the early to mid 90s, most notably with the 32-bit console generation with the Panasonic 3DO, Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn. Indie devs quickly began to realise the potential of these low poly aesthetics as they were able to invoke a sense of nostalgia and fear that modern games often find difficult to replicate, which was mainly due to the hardware, software limitations and working processes of the time. Iconic games such as Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil, Parasite Eve, Overblood, Dino Crisis, Silent Hill and Deep Fear were all able to utilise these elements to great effect that allowed them to become some of the greatest and scariest games of all time within the survival horror genre. PC game development teams would also get in on the action during this time, producing some of the most hair-raising and iconic games of all time, with the original Doom that set the standard for first-person horror games. 1998 would see the development and release of many legendary horror games with Resident Evil 2, but the evolution of ideas would become more precedented with Half-Life that expanded on the formula seen in Doom and other excellent FPS shooters, but added an almost cinematic appeal to its gameplay, and it was praised for its atmospheric horror and unique gameplay mechanics that would help pave the way for many other horror games to come. Half-Life and Doom, along with other lesser known games such as Hell Knight seen on the PlayStation, helped to provide the inspiration for future indie horror games to exist. One of the most successful and influential indie horror games in recent years would be Amnesia: The Dark Descent, developed by Frictional Games, a first-person survival horror game released in 2010 that was praised for its immersive gameplay and terrifying atmosphere, and has been widely credited with popularising the survival horror subgenre of horror games. Another influential indie horror game would be Outlast, released for the PC and consoles in 2013 and was praised for its immersive first-person gameplay and disturbing themes, which places players in the role of a journalist investigating a remote insane asylum overrun by homicidal patients. Outlast would spawn a sequel with Outlast 2 and an upcoming spin-off with the Outlast Trials. Other notable horror games include Slender the 8 Pages and Lone Survivor, while AAA companies would also be inspired to create more story-driven and atmospheric experiences with The Last of Us, Alien Isolation and Until Dawn. Soma, released in 2015, is a science fiction horror game that takes place in an underwater research facility and deals with themes of consciousness, artificial intelligence and the nature of humanity, with very disturbing themes and ideologies. These games have all contributed to the rise of indie horror titles and have helped to establish the genre as a popular and viable option for players looking for a good scale. One notable example of an indie horror game developer would be Dread XP, that is responsible for creating the Dread X collection, that releases small horror games developed by different indie developers on a yearly basis, where each game is made in a short period of time and focuses on exploration and survival horror, as well as a strong emphasis on atmosphere and storytelling. Another notable indie horror game developer is Chilla Arts, which is best known for creating games that rely heavily on psychological horror, using the player's own imagination to create a sense of fear and unease. Akamanto, one of the popular games developed by Chilla Arts, would be a prime example of many of these features utilising low poly visuals and aesthetics while viewing from a first person point of view to incorporate many of the psychological elements to great effect, while exploring an old school late at night to find that an entity known as Akamanto roams the rooms and corridors in search of victims, forcing the player to utilise puzzle solving and hiding mechanics to avoid the enemy and escape. Puppet Combo is another very popular indie horror game developer that is known for his unique style of horror games with a heavy emphasis on 80s nostalgia and slasher inspired gameplay, creating an eerie atmosphere that takes the player back to the golden age of horror movies. Some examples would be Nun Massacre, The Glass Staircase, Power Drill Massacre and Babysitter Bloodbath, among others, that will give you an idea of how unnerving and unsettling they are while showcasing the violent nature that these games offer. These are just some examples of the many talented individuals and teams that continue to expand on the ideas and boundaries of horror titles, which have allowed the indie horror game scene to continue to grow and evolve. So you may be asking yourself, what makes indie horror games so successful? One of the key factors is in the level of immersion and atmosphere that these games are able to create and represent. Indie developers often have smaller teams and budgets, as they are often forced to rely on creative game design and storytelling elements to create a sense of terror and unease. But more notably, indie developers also have a great willingness to take risks and try new things without restrictions compared to AAA companies. This can result in highly atmospheric and immersive experiences that can draw the players in and keep them on the edge of their seats. Because they are not beholden to the same financial pressures as larger studios, indie developers often are able to experiment with new gameplay mechanics and storytelling techniques that may not be viable for a larger studio. This has resulted in a wide range of innovative and unique horror games that offer players something different and fresh. The rise of indie horror games can also be attributed to the growing popularity of horror as a genre in the modern media. With the success of horror movies, TV shows and books, it's no surprise that horror games have also gained a larger audience, which has helped create a market for indie games to exist and has provided developers with a larger pool of potential players. Indie games development has also provided an entry point for passionate individuals to learn the fundamentals and creative aspects of games development while generating opportunities to express their creative freedom, which would simply not be possible if working for a mega-rich corporation, as there are too many pressures, political elements and social hierarchies associated with larger companies, leaving it difficult for new creators to get a foot in the door to gain experience, while also being too stressful to a point that it can seriously impact the individual's mental health. Indie games development is an avenue that removes all of those unwanted and unnecessary elements so people can focus on developing the best and most creative ideas possible for their games. The rise of indie horror games has been driven by a combination of factors, including the proliferation of digital distribution systems, the success of influential titles, the immersive and atmospheric nature of the gameplay offered by many of these unique titles, and the willingness of these developers to take risks and try new things to increase the overall awareness and popularity of the genre. These games have captured the attention and imagination of players and have established the indie horror game scene as a thriving and exciting part of the games industry. As these indie horror game developers have their own unique style, each providing a different experience for players by providing a variety of different gameplay styles, using many elements and a range of different themes and concepts. With a growing audience for these types of games and the increased availability of games development tools, it's likely that we will continue to see an increase in the number and diversity of indie horror games in the future. The rise of digital distribution platforms such as Steam has made it easier for indie developers to distribute and sell their games, which has led to an increase in the number of indie horror games available to play, as well as the popularity of these games among the industry in general. The flexibility and creativity allowed the indie game development scene to allow for more unique and diverse experiences compared to more generic AAA titles. And additionally, the popularity of survival horror and psychological horror in recent years have added to the indie horror game's popularity overall. Many indie games have also been able to achieve a level of viral popularity through online streaming services and word of mouth, which has helped to increase the popularity of many titles even further. And another factor that has contributed to the rise of indie horror games is the relatively low cost of development, with access to free and open source tools, making it easier and more accessible for individuals to dive into the world of indie games creation. The rise in indie survival horror games has also been popularised in recent years with the growth of online content creators, more notably on the likes of YouTube and TikTok, with many creators achieving great success as a result of their experiences with these games and sharing them with the world, which also help to increase the selling potential of these titles to the mainstream audience. As indie development studios often work with small teams and limited budgets, this would also work in their benefit, as it allows them to create and release games much more quickly and efficiently than larger studios. And this has led to a diverse range of indie horror games, from small experimental titles to fully realised high quality games that can compete with major studio releases in terms of gameplay and storytelling. Additionally, the indie horror game development scene has more freedom to explore unconventional themes and designs, which has led to the creation of unique and inventive horror experiences that may not have been possible with the constraints of major games development seen within AAA companies. These games often rely more heavily on atmosphere, storytelling and psychological horror rather than traditional jump scares, which can be more unpredictable and memorable for the players. As the popularity of indie horror games continue to rise, more and more players are discovering the unique and often terrifying experiences that these games offer. They also tend to have a much more personal touch and often are able to create a connection with the developer's personal experiences and emotions, which can bring an emotional weight to the game that players will also notice. Another aspect contributing to the rise of indie horror games is the emergence of game development tools and engines that are more accessible and are more cost efficient, which has allowed these small teams and even solo developers to create professional quality games with relative ease, which has led to a more open approach towards games development, or anyone with a passion and willingness for creating games can now learn to do so. This has also led to a surge in the popularity of resources, providing more opportunities to develop games that are inspired by past entries, that inspire the production of many quality examples that you now see today. And as mentioned, with the popularity of these horror titles, with the likes of streaming platforms and online video platforms with the likes of YouTube from various different types of content creators, many other online platforms, social media elements and communities have also helped in the rise and popularity of these unique titles that bring together players and developers, where players can share their experiences but also gives developers direct feedback on what they should focus on next and what they should really look into for their next future title. Websites such as itch.io, GameJolt and other indie game marketplaces make it easier for players to discover these new indie horror titles, while providing a platform for developers to share and promote their games, alongside of social media that has played a pivotal role in bringing attention to these games, where developers and players can share information and updates about the games that we play, as well as showcasing gameplay footage, screenshots and other types of content to inspire other players to get in on the experience. These elements will contribute to the success of several horror games, both critically and commercially, and you can see why games like Amnesia: The Dark Descent, Outlast and Soma, among many others, have gained enlarged popularity and have now a large fan base of players with many accolades achieved in recent years due to their very unique concepts and ideas. Many of these titles, alongside of more modern entries, are often well received by players and critics alike, as it reflects the very unique nature and ideas that are being proposed to the player, as people are always interested to see how the story or the elements of the game are going to play out, which presents many addictive qualities. And when we look at the majority of marketplaces, with regards to Steam, GoodOldGames.com, among many others, the majority of the games that are being sold on these platforms are mostly indie games from different types of genres, and some of the most popular are the survival horror entries, many of which are given early access to players during the initial early stages of development, so players can test and give feedback to the developers to see what is working and what they should improve on. Coupled with that, with the increase of game development tools and modelling features and engines such as Blender 3D, Unity, Unreal Engine and RPG Maker have also made it much easier for independent developers and fans to create professional quality games. And these tools would provide a relatively low learning curve for individuals to create various different types of quality of games, from low poly to more advanced and more beautiful looking, visually impressive games, while also having very large supportive communities which make it easier for developers to troubleshoot and seek help if needed. Many of these games and ideologies have helped to establish the indie horror game genre as a driving force within the video games industry, while having inspired many other developers to try their hand at creating their own horror games, even piquing the interest of AAA companies to start taking more action. And it's also worth mentioning that the success of these games have also proven that the survival horror genre is just as popular as it's ever been. Overall, the rise of indie horror games can be attributed to a combination of factors, including the increased accessibility of digital distribution platforms, the democratization of game development through more accessible tools and engines, and the success of several high-profile indie horror games. And the combination of these factors has created an environment where these games can now thrive, and players are discovering the unique and often terrifying experiences in all their glory. The future of indie horror games looks very promising, with AAA companies taking notice of the creative aspects seen by talented teams and individuals, leading the charge to have their ideas, opinions and creative concepts seen, with many new projects coming to light, with new innovative games and fan mods of remasters of older iconic classics, leading to larger companies hiring these talents to work on the development of huge upcoming projects, with examples of modern remakes or re-envisionings of many popular titles such as the Resident Evil series from Capcom. So when we look at the creativity aspects of indie games in general, there really is no limit to your creativity and the development processes that you plan to pursue, as it is the perfect avenue for new minds and ideas to take shape that will play an important role in the future of video games development, as we are no longer confined to the ideas and limitations of mainstream AAA companies, but we can now choose or look at the types of games we want to own or play, so there are opportunities available for anyone to get involved. It all starts with an idea. Even driving games are now getting the survival horror treatment, with many experimental ideas being developed that focus on heavy elements of fear and being isolated or alone while trying to avoid or escape an unknown entity or assailant, which results in these games having a tendency to be a lot creepier than you may think. With that being said, there are many more ideas and concepts that we can dive into to understand the lore behind these unique and individual horror games, which is why you need to check out this next video to see how the ideas of these type of games are expanding into different concepts.